The worst president in American history. Here's a question that breaks arguments at dinner tables, sparks wars in comment sections, and has kept historians up at night for over a century. Who was the worst president in American history? Now, your mind might jump to a familiar name, maybe someone recent, maybe someone you read about in high school, but history has a way of humbling us. Because when scholars, political scientists, and historians actually rank all 46 presidents using hard criteria like economic impact, constitutional integrity, crisis management, and legacy, one name keeps rising to the bottom, not because he was evil, not because he wanted to destroy the country, but because at the single most dangerous moment in American history, when the nation stood at the edge of the cliff, he looked down, froze, and did nothing. His name was James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, and the story of how one man's indecision, arrogance, and moral cowardice helped ignite the bloodiest war in American history. That story begins long before he ever sat in the Oval Office. To understand the catastrophe, you first have to understand the man. James Buchanan was born in 1791 in a log cabin in Pennsylvania. The son of a prosperous merchant, he was sharp, disciplined, and obsessively ambitious. By the time he was 22, he was already practicing law. By 30, he was in Congress. By his 40s, he had served as a senator, Secretary of State under James Polk, and minister to both Russia and Great Britain. On paper, Buchanan was the most qualified man ever to seek the American presidency. He had more political experience than almost any candidate before him. He was smooth, polished. He knew how Washington worked. He knew foreign policy. He dressed immaculately, carried himself with dignity, and spoke in the careful, measured language of a man who had spent decades in power. He was the ultimate establishment candidate, and in 1856, a nation desperate to avoid conflict chose exactly that. They wanted stability. They wanted someone who would keep the wheels turning. What they got was something far more dangerous than an incompetent fool. They got a brilliant man who knew what was coming and chose to look away. The world Buchanan inherited. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about 1856 America. The country was a powder keg, and everyone knew it. The issue was slavery, not just slavery as a moral question, though that fire was burning hotter than ever, but slavery as a political crisis. For decades, American politicians had been doing something extraordinary. They had been holding the country together through a series of increasingly fragile compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Each one bought a few more years of peace. Each one kicked the problem a little further down the road. But by the mid-1850s, the road was running out. In the Kansas Territory, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were literally shooting each other in the streets. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. A fanatical abolitionist named John Brown was hacking men to death with broadswords. Border ruffians from Missouri were storming polling stations at gunpoint. In Washington, a congressman named Preston Brooks walked onto the Senate floor and beat Senator Charles Sumner, an anti-slavery voice, nearly to death with a metal-tipped cane. And in parts of the South, Brooks was celebrated as a hero. The country was fracturing, visibly, loudly, violently. Into this world stepped James Buchanan, and his great mission, his singular, obsessive goal, was to simply make it stop, not by solving the underlying problem, not by confronting slavery head-on, but by finding one last compromise, one more deal, one more way to quiet the noise. He believed he could hold it together. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, Kansas and the Lecompton Constitution. But Buchanan wasn't done making things worse. In Kansas, the slavery crisis was playing out in real time. The territory needed to write a state constitution before it could apply for statehood. And the pro-slavery minority, through fraud, intimidation, and rigged elections, produced what was called the Lecompton Constitution. It was a grotesque document. It enshrined slavery. It had been approved through a vote so riddled with fraud that most anti-slavery settlers had boycotted it entirely. Even Stephen Douglas, Buchanan's own party colleague in the Senate, the man who had helped pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, stood up and said Lecompton was a fraud. He refused to support it. Buchanan supported it anyway. He pushed the Lecompton Constitution through every political channel he had. He twisted arms. He offered bribes. He threatened patronage. He deployed every tool of executive pressure available to him. Why? Because James Buchanan had made a calculation. He believed the Southern states, the powerful, wealthy, cotton-producing backbone of the Democratic Party, needed to be appeased. If they felt threatened, they would leave the Union. And if Buchanan could just give them what they wanted, they would stay. So he handed them Kansas. Congress ultimately rejected the Lecompton Constitution. Kansas would eventually enter the Union as a free state, but the damage was done. Buchanan had split his own party. Northern Democrats, furious at his capitulation to the slave power, were in open revolt. The Democratic Party, the only major national institution holding North and South together, was now broken. He had shattered the one coalition that could have held the country together, all in the name of keeping the peace. The economy collapses, and then, as if the political chaos wasn't enough, the economy fell apart. Just months into Buchanan's presidency, the panic of 1857 struck. Banks collapsed. Railroads went bankrupt. Unemployment surged in northern cities. Tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs. Buchanan's response: he did almost nothing. He believed, in keeping with the economic orthodoxy of the era, that the government had no business intervening in the economy. He vetoed a homestead bill that would have given Western land to settlers. He vetoed funding for agricultural colleges. He watched the economic crisis deepen and called it the natural consequence of Northern excess. The South, with its cotton economy, suffered less, and Buchanan said so publicly, essentially suggesting that the South's economic model was more stable than the North's. To Northern workers already furious about slavery, already anxious about their economic futures, this was a provocation. A sitting president was defending the slave economy while their families went hungry. The emerging Republican Party, meanwhile, had both a message, stop the expansion of slavery, and a ready-made economic platform that spoke directly to those struggling workers. Free land, federal investment in infrastructure, opportunity. Buchanan had handed them the election of 1860 on a silver platter. The John Brown raid, October 16, 1859. John Brown, the abolitionist terrorist, the man whose hands were already stained with the blood of Kansas, descended on Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He seized the federal armory there with a small band of followers, hoping to spark a slave rebellion across the South. It failed. Within days, Brown was captured, ironically, by a colonel named Robert E. Lee. He was tried, convicted, and hanged, but what happened next terrified the South beyond all reason. Across the North, significant voices began calling Brown a martyr. Ralph Waldo Emerson said Brown had made the gallows as glorious as the cross. Henry David Thoreau called him an angel of light. To Southern slaveholders, this was proof of their worst fears. The North didn't just want to stop the expansion of slavery. They wanted to arm their enslaved people. They wanted blood. They wanted the destruction of the Southern way of life. Buchanan's response: he condemned Brown, assured the South that the North's reaction did not represent mainstream opinion, and then watched as the country spiraled further toward catastrophe. He had no plan, no strategy, no vision for how to pull the country back from the edge. Just words, and silence, and inaction. The election of 1860. The election of 1860 was unlike anything America had ever seen. The Democratic Party, shattered by Buchanan's Kansas disaster, split in two. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, threw John Bell into the ring. And the Republicans nominated a one-term former congressman from Illinois, whom most of Washington dismissed as a country lawyer with too many jokes. Abraham Lincoln won, with less than 40% of the popular vote, without a single electoral vote from any Southern state. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, and James Buchanan, still president for 4 more months, faced the moment of truth. The final failure: Buchanan does nothing. This is where historians go from frustrated to genuinely astonished. Buchanan's response to secession was a masterpiece of paralysis. On December 3, 1860, he delivered his annual message to Congress. He spent pages condemning the South for threatening secession, and then, in the same document, he argued that the federal government had no legal authority to stop them. He managed to simultaneously argue that secession was illegal and that nothing could be done about it. He insisted that the crisis was the North's fault for agitating against slavery. He refused to reinforce federal forts in the South. He refused to declare a state of emergency. He refused to take any executive action that might be seen as provocative. His Attorney General, Jeremiah Black, told him he had the authority to act. His Secretary of State, Lewis Cass, a man in his late 70s, resigned in protest, furious at Buchanan's inaction. By January 1861, 7 states had seceded. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was organizing a government. Southern forces were seizing federal property, federal armories, federal forts. Buchanan watched it happen. He told himself he was preserving peace. He told himself Lincoln would sort it out. He told himself that if he just kept the temperature low until March 4th, Inauguration Day, he could hand off a country that was still, technically, intact. What he handed Abraham Lincoln was a nation already at war with itself, just not yet shooting. Lincoln would call it the worst inheritance any incoming president had ever received. Why does this matter? The legacy. Now, wait, and this is important. James Buchanan was not evil. He was not a monster. He was not a villain twirling his mustache in the Oval Office. He was something arguably more tragic. He was a brilliant, experienced, deeply knowledgeable man who understood exactly what was happening and responded to it with fear, calculation, and moral cowardice. He prioritized the unity of his party over the survival of his country. He prioritized short-term peace over long-term justice. He believed that if he just kept everyone calm enough, kept every compromise intact, kept every powerful interest satisfied, the problem would somehow resolve itself. It never does. Historians have consistently ranked him last, or near last, in presidential rankings for over 50 years. The American Political Science Association's most recent comprehensive survey placed him dead last. C-SPAN's historian surveys have repeatedly put him at the bottom, not because he was incompetent, but because he was complicit. He could have acted. He had legal authority to act. He had military resources. He had political capital. He had 4 years, in which he could have made choices that might have changed the trajectory of what came next. Instead, 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War that began just weeks after he left office. There is a lesson buried in the wreckage of James Buchanan's presidency. It isn't a comfortable one. We often imagine that the worst leaders are the reckless ones, the firebrands, the radicals, the men who charge forward without thinking. But history offers a darker possibility. Sometimes the most catastrophic failures come from men who think too much and act too little. Men so afraid of making the wrong move that they make no move at all. Men so desperate to preserve what exists that they lose sight of what exists for. The United States was not founded as an abstraction. It was founded on a set of ideas, imperfectly, hypocritically, with enormous moral failure baked into its founding documents. But those ideas pointed somewhere. They pointed towards something better. James Buchanan spent his presidency protecting a system that betrayed those ideas. He did it carefully, methodically, and with the full weight of his considerable intellect. And when the bill finally came due, when 620,000 Americans lay dead in fields from Gettysburg to Vicksburg to Cold Harbor, James Buchanan retired to his Pennsylvania estate and spent the rest of his life writing his memoirs, insisting that history would vindicate him. It has not. It will not. Because leadership isn't just about knowing what's right. It's about having the courage to act on it, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs you everything, even when the weight of the whole country is pressing down on you. That is the burden of the office. James Buchanan carried it to the grave. If this story made you think, if it changed the way you see the presidency, American history, or what real leadership actually looks like, then hit that subscribe button, because we are just getting started. On this channel, we don't do surface-level history. We go deep. We find the moments that shape the country you live in today, the decisions, the failures, the miracles, and we tell them the way they deserve to be told. Next time, we're going somewhere else entirely. Stay tuned. And if you want to keep exploring the era this video only scratched the surface of, check out our full series on the American Civil War, linked right up here. History is not the past. It's a mirror. And what it reflects, that's entirely up to you to face.